Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
Hello. I remember being a new correspondent in Russia in the early 90s, taking a wrong turning and driving right up to the door of the Kremlin. Today, a lot of people in Russia and outside it are asking if the country itself has taken a wrong turn. Vladimir Putin's Kremlin has become a fortress of unrivalled power. He's turned ruthlessly on domestic foes and on foreign influences too. Well, round the table to unravel the enigma of Mr. Putin and of the diverse and troubled country he leads, I'm joined by the historian and academic Vladislav Zubok, by Oliver Bülow, who's embarked on an adventure to understand the traces of the Soviet past in the present, and by Rachel Polonsky, who's written about the culture of Russia. But let's start with Fiona Hill. She's co-author of a book on Putin's rise to power entitled Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. Fiona, you characterise Putin as a Mr. Ben type figure, various roles that he plays in public life when it suits him or when he needs the votes. Who is the real Putin?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think we'll ever really know who is the real Putin. Maybe not even after some time has elapsed, if he ever leaves the political stage, because there's so many uncertainties about elements of his biography. But just like Mr. Ben, which was my favourite cartoon when I was a kid here in the UK, not everybody outside of the UK quite grasped the Mr. Ben concept, but I think for anyone listening today, if they remember that from the 70s and 80s, remember Mr. Ben was something of a faceless cartoon figure, but then he assumed these great identities with every day's new adventure in the magic costume shop. And Putin has done exactly the same. He's been a blank slate for the Russian people because there's so little known about his real background. He has been able to assume sometimes these rather fantastical guises. He's been, again, like Mr. Ben, a firefighter. He's been a deep-sea diver, though we actually now know he didn't dive quite so deep when he was retrieving an amphora from the bottom of the Black Sea. It was apparently only about 10 feet or something like that, a few metres. But nonetheless, he's really got into the spirit of this. And the question is why? Part of it is to create this very vigorous political image. It's been a way of showing everybody he's the action man for Russia. He's the person who can really do everything, the indispensable figure. But it's also a part of mobilisation of the population.
Because he targets various... I noticed that there's one website which has 39 different images of him, including calming a tiger, as you do, hunting
right.
bears, doing any
exactly.
possible demographic,
and basically tagging whales, anything imaginable. And actually, the things that you've just picked up on there, he says are very important for him. That's conservation. It's taking pride in Russia's vast territory and its nature. He's trying to mobilise the Russian population behind various causes, not just in support of him. He actually says that he himself selects many of these roles that he plays. And of course, this just further obfuscates what is the real Mr. Putin.
But what did you then make of the announcement of the divorce from Ludmilla, his long-standing and possibly long-suffering wife? Because that was a case where he was putting himself out there as a man like any other with family troubles, albeit quite controlled. That's a different side of a Russian leader. They often don't like to be seen as having weaknesses or family turmoil.
And Putin is actually, that's very interesting that he's done this, because Putin is somebody who's really put his private life off limits. One of the things that has been extraordinarily difficult before this announcement was actually to find any details out about Ludmilla and his two daughters. His daughters are conspicuously absent from this incredible array of public imagery. Ludmilla hadn't been seen with Putin for years, in fact. There were even rumours in Russia that she'd been sent to a nunnery, which is rather medieval, even in the Russian context. And I think in many respects he stepped forward because he's obviously now in the process of recrafting his public image again. Something that Putin has done has been engaged in this perpetual political campaign. And every time there's a sense of trouble, which is one of the junctures that we are now, he comes up with some new invention of self. And as I said, because we know so little about him, now we know he's divorced or in the process of divorcing, certainly that he and Ludmilla have formally separated. The idea that he's now about to go on to a second stage, and everybody in Russia is now waiting to see what's going to be the second act.
Well, Vladislav, you were nodding there as Fiona laid out the persona and the use of the persona, but this is clearly a very personalised system of governance. Does it then stand or fall with Mr. Putin himself?
Well, I read with great interest what Fiona said about six identities of Mr. Putin. I love this word identity. You can use it right and left. I've been using it myself often. One identity that Putin can no longer use, I think, is the identity of outsider. definitely. He used it quite cleverly in the past. He was brought in as an outsider to break the patronage clans and networks, and of course, as always, he ended up on top of everything. But now he's the boss, and there's a new identity that has very clear connotations in Russian and Soviet history. Who was called Khazyain in Russian was Joseph Stalin, of course, under different circumstances. I'm not here to draw this, primitive parallels between Putin and Stalin, but he's forced now by these circumstances to adapt his behavior to this role and to this identity, and this is what the majority of the country expects from him.
But do you see it as stirring up the past and a nationalist identity that reaches back to the past, even if people aren't aware of it when they respond to a particular advertising image?
No, I think Putin's used past, so usable past, is very short, actually. I think he at some point became an officer of the KGB under the influence of this romantic story about Soviet intelligence during World War II. So that's why World War II remains for him the beginning and maybe the end of Russian-Soviet history. But aside from that, the deeper knowledge of Russian history, I just don't see him playing any role like Stalin used to play, like Ivan the Terrible, and so on and so forth. And by the way, later on I will touch on this.
Please do. Rachel, you write cultural history. You often make comparisons across the centuries. Do you see him fitting into a cultural archetype with this particular appeal to the public?
Well, Fiona in her book has talked about him reaching back into the Tsarist past. And I think to the extent that there's autocracy in Russia, he has to reach back, because Tsarism was constructed through what one American historian, Richard Wortman, calls scenarios of power. So Putin's perpetually creating and recreating new scenarios of power, new mythologies around himself to either intimidate or seduce. As Fiona says in her book, he's always working on the population as an operative, the way a KGB officer works on an individual. He works on the nation. So these scenarios of power are now enacted through TV, through YouTube clips, where he presents himself with these different faces. So on the one hand, he can be seducing, as I think he was again in that very, very controlled clip in which the divorce was announced. Again, always turn anything into an opportunity. Maybe this was a bad aspect of his private life, but it's going to be turned into a good opportunity to create a scenario of power. And the message that it projected was the only other woman for Putin is the Russian nation. His press secretary made a clear announcement. Anybody who looks at him can see he's totally wrapped up in his role as the guardian, the keeper, the khazyain, as Vlad said.
It's a jolly good excuse if the other woman is Russia, isn't it? One we must all bear in mind.
Well, the other woman feels very flattered, even if you're beating her on the head.
Oliver, your journey through, in many ways, through the recent past of Russia and through the history of one man, the priest, we'll talk about a bit later. But how much do you think, when you look at Putin now, that he arises out of the Soviet system, and how much do you see him as a throwback to something else, to the central strong man, the desire for control in a sometimes rather chaotic land?
Well, actually, I have to say, one of the things reading Fiona's book that really struck me was how Putin's appeal and the way he's tried to construct himself was actually quite international. It's this sort of, his constituencies are sort of this sort of vague nostalgia for a better past and this sort of general slight xenophobia and this sort of putative outsider status. And I amused myself about halfway through the book by every time I came across the words Vladimir Putin, replacing them with Nigel Farage. And I found myself sort of thinking, well, actually, that kind of the UKIP phenomenon and the Putin phenomenon.
In fairness to Mr. Farage, has been in no way as autocratic.
Well, no, I mean, but all I meant is how he came, how he presented himself at the very beginning is quite this sort of outsider status. It's very interesting that, and I also thought, what's quite fun looking at what happened in the past is the way that humour was always used as a mode of opposition to particularly Soviet leaders, and how this has been mirrored now in Russia with these online photos. Anytime anything happens, so there was that massive meteorite, and instantly, within minutes, you get a shot of the meteorite with Putin with his top off, riding the meteorite through the sky. Or, when Felix Baumgartner jumped out of that balloon at sort of 1,000,000 feet or whatever it was, instantly you get a photo of Putin riding a bird with his top off, sort of waving him out of the balloon.
Well, Fiona, that's true, isn't it? There is a sort of irony about this. I mean, the Russian population is not stupid, and many, many educated, quite ironical people who I also noticed that if you go onto Russian websites, there are very, very funny, subverted images of him doing things that are even more improbable than the things he does put out there. This is still a very personalised role. There was a reason behind it, but I suppose what interests me, apart from Putin himself, is what it says about the political system. Does it all revolve around him, whether or not he's been Mr. Ben on Monday and Mr. Putin on Tuesday?
Well, unfortunately, since he said he was coming back and, using the Hollywood imagery, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who always seems to come back and reinvent himself in the Terminator or whatever movie he's in now, Putin has made the system all about him. I think we could actually say that during this strange dual monarchy, or the tandem of Medvedev and Putin, that it wasn't quite like that. For 4 years we actually had, and that's what everybody was really reacting to when there was basically the rise of the opposition movement in 2011 and 2012, was the idea that the system was widening out, and for once that it wasn't really about one man or just one particular clique. It seemed to be that with nominating Medvedev as the president, Dmitry Medvedev, for 4 years.
Since 2008, after he'd had 2 terms.
That's correct, yeah, and he was sort of stepping back a little, and he himself said it's not healthy for a system to have everything in the hands of one man. And then he said, I'm coming back again, and I'm picking it up, and here I am.
I think that may possibly a case of read the small print.
Exactly.
But Rachel, you travelled a lot and have followed a lot along protesters inter alia, the mood at that time. Is it all about one man, or underneath Mr. Putin are there others waiting in the wings who could transform the Russian system?
Well, I think he's made great success in making it the case that there are no people waiting in the wings that are credible. I wanted to get back to what you were saying, Anne, about laughter and humour. One of the notable features of the last recent phase in Russian politics is the re-emergence of political satire. And as Oliver says, the internet is a wonderful tool for laughter. And interestingly, 2 weeks before the presidential election of March 2012, there was a very interesting debate on TV. And Putin never debates. He never participates in the debates because, again, he's supposed to be too busy running the country, and these dilettantes who are standing against him have time to debate, but he can't debate. So in his place, representatives were debating for him. So in one debate, there was a wonderful debate between the film director, Nikita Mikhalkov, very famous, talented film director, who is very much on the nationalist side of things, and on the other side, a wonderful woman called Irina Prokhorova, who's the sister of the billionaire Mikhail Prokhorov, who was standing against Putin. And the first question the moderator asked was, is it significant? And there were no discussions, by the way, of policy. Is it significant that humour has returned? She said yes, it's a great sign that people are disenchanted with the leader. And Nikita Mikhalkov, who doesn't think people are disenchanted, said no, it's not even a return of humour. So I think that's a very interesting feature of the latest phase.
Vlad?
Well, I would throw a bucket of pessimism into this, bathtub of optimism. I think, I've lived through several moments in Soviet history when in so-called Soviet intelligentsia used humor. And then it became a satire against Leonid Brezhnev, stagnation, the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Then this satire turned into sarcasm, and this sarcasm slowly died out into cynicism. Yes. And this is what I expect may happen this time again.
Is that the way that you see the mood of the country at the moment?
Well, perhaps I lived long enough. That's why I say if things go in the way they've been going, that humour will not save.
Oliver?
I thought one of the most lovely things about the protests in 2011 and 2012, and I think why people were so moved by them, is because they seemed so idealistic, which was totally unexpected. I mean, I lived in Russia for, 7 years, and it's just this total, all-penetrating sense of nihilism and sarcasm about everything. And suddenly people were out on the street and saying, we can change things. And
yeah, it was a sudden dilution of cynicism. But now, a year later, people are saying, what happened? There's nobody out on the streets. Nobody's coming to the protests anymore. Where are all these people who are laughing on the internet? Why aren't they coming back on the streets? And another writer wrote another article.
One reason is that one of the main movers in that protest, so I think Navalny is undergoing a trial.
Yes, and there are not just Navalny, but there are dozens of people who were involved in a protest last May who are all still remanded in custody in horrible conditions awaiting trial. We don't even know their names, but there are dozens of them.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, picking up on what Vlad said and, what's going around on the table here about where things are heading, I mean, this is very reminiscent of the Perestroika period. And one of the significant things of that period, which was, the mid-1980s to around 1990, was that Putin wasn't there. He was actually in Dresden in the KGB at the time, watching East Germany fall down around him. But people like Medvedev and all the people that we saw out on the streets in the Bolotnaya protest, the older people that we saw, the people who were in their late 40s and beyond, a bit like me and Vlad here, they were all there for Perestroika, and they thought this was an opportunity again. That was the last time there was a great flourishing of humour.
Do you think it's significant that he missed out, which is something I must say never occurred to me? I was in East Germany at the same time as Putin. Funny enough, we never met.
And if you did, you'd never remember.
Yes, exactly. We moved in different circles, I think it would be fair to say. But it is an interesting thought.
You can never be sure you haven't met.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. The man without a face, or with many. But that he missed it. He missed this moment which, for all its failures, was absolutely significant in forming a view that Russia could change. And he wasn't there for that.
Well, I think that points us, in the direction of world affairs and Putin's view of the world. That is something that we should at some point discuss in depth. He was there when the Berlin Wall fell. He saw how quickly everything can collapse. This was much more rapid collapse, actually, than even the Soviet collapse was in the 1991. And also it poses a question of Russia's role in the world. What will be if liberals come to power in Russia, liberal Democrats come to power in Russia. Everybody watched, I think, around the table, watched that real propaganda reel on YouTube or somewhere. Within 5 minutes, Putin's spin doctors showed that Russia would perish if somebody like Prokhorov would come to power. It will be sold lock, stock, and barrel to the Americans, to the UN, whoever. It will be gone. So it's a very, very potent image that, the opposition never really found an adequate response to this image, I'm afraid.
That's right. It's about scaring the population in the most extreme form. The end of the debate I was talking about, Mikhalkov was talking, and Irina Prokhorova was just saying, stop scaring people, stop scaring people. And the image is, as Vlad says, the country will be taken over. It will just become an oil resource of America, and the people will become slaves.
Let me just put a slightly different view of Putin, which is one many Russians share, that is they've got back something with Putin. They've got back some standing, some pride in themselves. Your book obviously focuses on the very depressing side of Russia, the reliance on alcohol and the extreme alcoholism in many parts of the population. But there's also a feeling, particularly among people who don't have very much, that Putin has given them, restored some sort of glory to the country. Well,
I think it's true. To be fair to the guy, I think he has. If you look at how, I moved to Russia in 1999 and it was chaos, and total chaos. In a most wonderful way when you're a 20-year-old, it was amazing, but not somewhere that I would have wanted to live forever. It was, and whereas now, particularly if in Moscow and St. Petersburg or Perm or the other big cities, you go there and it's really quite nice compared to how it was. And that, I think, that recognition of the fact that Putin has restored a degree of pride, and you can see it, and to demography and life expectancy statistics is something I get very involved with. You can actually see it in the numbers. Russians now, they're not living as long as they were in 1964 or indeed in 1987, but they are living significantly longer than they were 10 years ago.
Vlad, you've written a lot about this transition from Yeltsin to Putin, trying to answer that question that Fiona was tussling with at the beginning, is how does he come about, where does he get the power from? How much do you think he is simply an anti-reaction to the chaos of the Yeltsin years? Oliver was there shortly after, I was aware, during them, and they really were a very disruptive time in the history of the country.
Well, I'm deeply convinced it's the main reason for why people continue to support Vladimir Vladimirovich, and the whole idea of there's no alternative to Putin is still very, very important. The only alternative that people have in their usable past, again, is the 90s, the chaos on the 90s. And it's actually quite easy to remind people what happened in the 90s because, indeed, everyone lived through it. Or, people who are younger, they have their parents constantly grumbling about that, Gorbachev such and such who, destroyed the country, and such Yeltsin who finish the job. So it's a very easy, it's a very easy task to counterpose oneself to those people and say, I'm the great assembler of Russian lands. And by the way, we haven't mentioned the Chechnya War, and we haven't mentioned Tatarstan separatism and other, noises.
Other levers which were used.
Russia was falling apart.
Power.
I have quite a few friends, several friends who began to investigate, in the West, Western scholars who began to investigate whether Russia would survive during the next 10 years. Now people no longer do it.
I mean, this is, however, the big challenge for Putin now, when we were talking about the divorce from Lyudmila and the idea that, he can now have a second act potentially with his beloved Russia, is that he's not giving much of a perspective for the future. And that's, except for one that's perpetually with him, potentially out till 2024. Because he runs his entire persona and this personalised politics against this backdrop of the 1990s. And that's why all the people that Rachel and Oliver, have been looking at, are finding it less credible at certain levels that, Putin is the man, is the only indispensable man, because many of them don't have that same memory of the 1990s. As Vlad said, it's the somewhat older people.
I wondered about that, because I think anyone anything to do with it, the Yeltsin years are ingrained in you. But of course, you're getting a generation coming on who know it through their parents. People don't always agree with the view their parents.
Yeah, exactly. They didn't live it. It's just like, in the UK, growing up in the 60s and 70s when everyone was talking about the war or what the 50s were like, eventually everybody decided to rebel against it. We had a whole flourishing of popular culture, and that's what you're seeing in Russia. Popular culture and society are moving along very quickly, and Putin has got everybody sort of fixed in place, still thinking, look, we've got to still deal with this legacy of the 1990s, and many other people now saying, but where are we going? Where are we heading? What does Russia look like in the next 12 years?
Rachel, do you want to have a stab at what Russia looks like in the next 12 years?
It's a very troubling picture, and what's so tragic about it is that the good people who are trying to do things at the grassroots and actions in civil society to make their lives better and to make their communities better are often thwarted by corruption, and that has not decreased under Putin, although, as Oliver says, standard of living went racing up in the first 2 terms of Putin. The oil price was high, the coffers were full, and it was. I was living there too at that time, and it was from week to week noticeable, and that, of course, is highly significant. But what is civil society allowed to do?
Can I just ask something else, Vlad? I can imagine some people listening to this, Russians and some not, thinking, well, what. The West distrusts Russia, Russia distrusts the West. It's a kind of mirror into which both sides look to reconfirm their own prejudices and their own superiority. Are we in danger of getting into that a bit when we take apart Mr. Putin's Russia?
I wouldn't take the next step and say we're heading for another Cold War. I don't think so. But there's some sense among people of older generation and also among young people, less so, about some kind of vicious cycle in the relationship between Russia and, let's say, the West. Russia has never found its place in the structures that the West was building. Now, to such an extent, when Putin meets the Chinese leader, he suggests, let's build the structures of our own, let's build our own Bretton Woods system. And this is the reflection of this frustration that is not only Putin's. Putin just gives us a voice. It's a frustration of even some Russian liberals who, throughout the 90s, saw the NATO expanding eastward. They saw, European Union enlarging, and the place for Russia remained unclear, unanchored in a sense.
Do you think that was a mistake by the West?
To say it is a mistake means that there was some kind of conscious policy on the West. I just don't see any conscious policy to exclude Russia. Certainly it was not the policy of Clinton, the Clinton presidency, or not the policy of Schroeder. They tried, they did their best. Maybe it was a failure of imagination, but the result is here on the table, and we still don't know what to do with this country, with Russia. I mean, people used to say it's dangerous to leave Germany on its own, sort of between Russia and France. Now, is it dangerous to leave Russia on its own between China and the West? I don't know.
Well, let's dig a bit more into granular detail about Russia, the grain in particular, with Oliver Bülow. Oliver, your latest book, Last Man in Russia, The Struggle to Save a Dying Nation, focuses on the story of one man, an Orthodox priest who talked openly and passionately about the scourge of vodka and what it said about Russia's tattered soul. Tell us a bit more about him.
Well, it's a bit of an accidental biography, really, this book. I didn't set out to write a biography. In fact, it's not really a typical biography anyway. Anyone who goes to Russia notices how much people drink. This is not a secret. In fact, just about the first train journey I ever took between Moscow and St. Petersburg, I got ludicrously drunk at the expense of a Russian woman with a jerry can full of moonshine. And I was 20 years old and thought, this is absolutely wonderful. This is it. I could live this. And the problem is it's so much fun. There's this getting drunk in Russia. There's a ritual to it with the toasts and a generosity and this extraordinary hospitality of this sort of, no one wants to get drunk on their own, so they say, let's get drunk. It's wonderful. But it's very important to understand, and it's sort of a realisation that only came to me more slowly, was that this is actually a serious problem. It's very pathological. As I mentioned earlier, but if you look at Britain, the life expectancy figures in Britain have risen more or less uninterruptedly since records began. In Russia, Russians still don't live as long as they did in 1964. If you think of all the medical advances that have happened in the last 50 years, they've all been cancelled out and more by vodka.
There are some fascinating details in your book, like the consumption being between 3 and 4 times as much as it would be in a European country, which just must have a devastating effect.
Well, it does, particularly for men. And I mean, what's interesting is this is generally seen as a traditional Russian thing. This has always been the case. And indeed, if you read accounts of Russian villages, particularly on St. Michael's Day at the end of the harvest in the 19th century, it was, so extraordinary that it makes Cardiff city centre on a Friday look pretty tame. But compared to what was happening now, it really took off after the Second World War. And the point I was very keen to make in the book is that this is a reaction to the stagnation and the sort of lack of hope and trust in society, that people turned to drink because there really wasn't anything else. All the institutions that people had relied on. And you have to realise that social change in the Soviet Union was incredibly fast. It went from an 80% peasant society to a sort of proletarian society in a couple of decades.
But there's also an ambiguity about the role of drink, isn't there? Where the centre occasionally tries to clamp down. Gorbachev, notably with his reforms, made himself very unpopular, but he saw the problem. And I think it's only at the start of this year that beer has been classified as an alcoholic drink in Russia.
Well, yeah, it is. Beer has always had this sort of slightly peculiar role, and as a result, you do notice if you go to work in the morning in Moscow, you'll see young women drinking beer on the tube. It's quite an unusual thing, the way that drink has this role. But Father Dmitri, the priest who's centrepiece of the book, why I chose him and why he became so important to me was that he was one of the first people to notice this issue and write about it in an uncensored way, because he was among the dissidents, and so he wrote for this sort of self-published form of literature that the dissidents relied on.
This is when?
This was, well, he came out of the Gulag in the mid-50s, having been sent there for writing an anti-Stalin poem, and then in the 60s and 70s he was a priest in Moscow, and he began to notice the number of people coming to him, particularly women, obviously talking about their husbands drinking, and he tried to create a community around his parish where people trusted each other and had hope for the future. And this was his way of trying to combat alcoholism. And some of the stories that people who knew him told me about how he stopped their husbands drinking are extraordinary. He was an amazing man, and I really wanted to try and sort of regain his place in history.
Vladislav, this low birth rate, high mortality rate, problems linked to alcohol, not only.
Absolutely, it's number one problem. I think it's a huge problem, and I want to congratulate Oliver on this book. He raised I think the most crucial issue. Of course, it's not the only problem, but let me tell you, alcoholism has many roots. Historically, the agricultural cycle, you have the ritual of sort of drinking at the end of it. There was also a Soviet element in it. It was an important item in Soviet budget, particularly after the war. There was the war experience when Stalin forced all the soldiers of the Soviet army to drink alcohol before the battle. But lack of trust, destruction of solidarity, destruction of human dignity, particularly among men, I think is number one problem. And what happens, this is my own experience growing up in the Soviet Union, men have almost unrestrained desire to bond somehow through alcohol and to replace a huge, something that is a huge thing for them, dignity and solidarity among men.
Is it specifically a male problem?
It's unfortunately cross-gender. I mean, women drink also at much higher rates in Russia, but not to the same scale, obviously, as the men.
It started among the men, I think.
Yes, and then it kind of moved across. And as Oliver said, this has had a really terrible impact on not just the life expectancy, but also on the birth rate. But this is where Putin comes in as quite significant, and has been one of the sort of secrets of his own image making, is that he does not drink. And some of the commentary about Ludmilla explaining why she chose Putin as her husband in all of the press reports we've had since the announcement of divorce. So she said some of the key things were, 1, he didn't drink, and 2, he didn't beat her. The two things obviously going together to some degree. But Putin is an unusual person in the Russian circumstances, because he was very serious about sport when he was younger, so he didn't drink and didn't smoke, and he's made a virtue out of this. It was one of the reasons, in many respects, why he may have been selected to replace Yeltsin, who was a notorious drunk, because Putin was the sober new face, and he has presented himself as this throughout. All these different personas are ones that depend on not drinking.
And this is why he remained an outsider, because in Russia
you don't bond with
you
people.
Don't bond with people, and your career suffers.
But isn't that also true, Oliver, of your character, or main character, Father Dudko, who is a very flawed hero in your book, isn't he? He gives these fantastic sermons, he inspires people, he builds a community of trust in the church, and then finally he is broken by the KGB. He recants, he goes on television and he says terrible things. So he's cut himself off from this culture at the same time as he wants to elevate it.
Well, he was very much rooted in the Russian nation. I mean, one of the reasons I chose him is because every experience he lived through, I mean, he lived through famine, collectivization, occupation. He was in the army, he was in the Gulag. He was, he's like Russian 20th century history in miniature. But that also made him very vulnerable, because he didn't want to be outside Russian society. He was Russian and incredibly proud of it. And so when the KGB managed to turn on him and use that patriotism against him, and yes, they broke him. It's one of the reasons, again, I chose him, is because he isn't a hero. He was just an ordinary person who happened to find himself doing an extraordinary thing.
And do you think you ever had a chance in what he was up against? Because you do put across this despair that people feel about alcoholism, but pretty much as a metaphor for other areas of lost trust and lost faith in the ideal of Russia.
Well, it's undoubtable that he saved individual lives. He stopped people drinking and actually saved people. And that, I think, is his legacy. Even though he tried to create a movement, he failed, but he did save individuals, which is better than nothing.
Rachel Polonsky.
One of the things that resonated for me in Oliver's book was the portrait of the role of priests out in the regions, in the grassroots. And, of course, the Patriarchate of Moscow projects a particular face, which is very wrapped up with the Kremlin, this Byzantine model of power. But out there is a phenomenon of local priests really rebuilding communities, and we mustn't forget that, and also encouraging people to have more children and to look after their children and not to drink.
I was out in January in the Tver region, which isn't far from Moscow, but if you go there, it's blighted. It's like a nuclear winter, particularly in January. And I was there for Orthodox Christmas, and we were trying to find somewhere to celebrate Christmas in a church. We found a village with a functioning church, and simply because of the priest, there was a market there. It felt alive because by sheer force of will, he was managing to hold this village together. And these people tend to be sent as far away as possible from Moscow, because these are not the people the Patriarch wants.
But Rachel, what about people opposing Putin now, perhaps the heirs to Father Dudko, when he was being held up as a great sign of the dissidency? But how much do you see what has happened since Putin's re-election that means that there is an energised force out there? Or do you think that it really was over before it started?
Well, I think the mood about protest is very depressed. I think that phase is over. The euphoria of winter of 2011, 2012 is gone. It's rushed away. But one of the things that people said to me at the time was, it's not Russia's changed, we've changed as individuals. We now want to not be cynical. We want to do something for our country. We want to be patriotic. We want to change things at the grassroots level. And I think that's where it's going to happen. And, with luck, it can happen. But it's a sad picture of small deeds of goodness.
It's also about trying to read a generation, isn't it, while you're still in it? Because one of the points I think you've made in various writings, Vlad, is that you've got a kind of generational skip, that the generation that could perhaps have been reformers, became disillusioned, left the country if they could, or just turned away from politics. And you have a fairly hard-nosed young generation, their 20s, 30s now, just think, well, I'll get on if I can get on and I don't care about the politics.
Well, it's a new grass, and let's see if it will be cut or it will grow further. One thing I have to raise with regard to that story about Father Dudko, every Russian at some point has to confront this question, particularly dealing with a state like it is in Russia. What does it mean to be a Russian? What does it mean to be patriotic? And the KGB, we don't know what the KGB officers told Father Dudko, but they presented him with a choice. If you're with Russia, you must be with us. You must be with the Russian state, but because we're surrounded by enemies. And there's whatever, American Jewish conspiracy, whatever. I know what they said in the 70s. It was a time when, many dissidents were Jewish, Jewish background, anti-Semitism was raised. And the same thing is happening with today with this generation. Are you patriotic? Aren't you see that Russia is being pressured from outside? Are you with us or against us? If you're against us, register as foreign agents.
How does that then fit, Rachel, with this generation sometimes meet their representatives in business, in the media to a certain extent, who are very internet savvy, they know what's going on in the West? Do they accept this rather stark choice that Vlad was laying out about loyalty and that test to Russia?
I think people are being very much put to the test, and I think the problem for Russia is that, again, the pressure is on the elite. There was a very striking thing that happened in the last fortnight, which is that the head of the new economics school, whose name is Sergei Guriev, had to leave the country. He took a one-way ticket to Paris because he was being put under pressure by the police for having done an independent report on a trial that looked to many people like a political trial. And he was a cream of the establishment, someone who was absolutely a good face of liberal Russia, not a protester, not a street protester.
Technocratic liberal, I call
yes.
them.
Technocratic liberal, and he took a one-way ticket out. Why? Because he said, I am not going to take the risk for my family of going to prison.
And of course that comes in the context of the trial of Alexander Lebedev, also the Pussy Riots trial. The trials, I suppose, change the public mood. Fiona Hill.
Yes, they're very much targeted, though, at a very specific group, which is the group that we're kind of talking about here, which are the technocratic elements in society, these urban professionals and higher who have gone on to serve the government and thought that they were somehow within the establishment and within those bounds could say an awful lot of things that they're now finding there were even more limits than they had suspected. And they're also in the groups that we, from the outside mostly associate with, the kind of people that everybody's seeing in London all the time, the people who travel widely, who are very savvy. But, there are other Russias there, and this is the Russias that Oliver has been describing. We have to remember Russia is a very dynamic and a very variegated society here. And Putin and the people around him...
But of course the difference is we are meeting, as you say, a small number, but representatives of that generation building lives outside Russia, which of course unthinkable. Glad you said you grew up in the Soviet Union. I covered the end of it. That you would be meeting.
Sometimes I don't believe it myself that I grew up in the Soviet.
But there were all the people who were not doing this, though, because look, it's easy for Guriev and others who had ties elsewhere to go, and the government has actually encouraged people like that. There's an exit strategy that's there. It's all the people.
You think they really are exporting some of their brightest?
They've actually
people?
said it quite openly, and Guriev himself, at an international conference not so long ago, said that was he recognised it, a policy of the government to encourage those who want to be the intellectual dissidents to go to London, to go to Paris. It's the people who are out in the countryside, the vast majority of the Russians who don't travel so much and who have a different way of thinking about the future. Those are Putin's silent majority, his constituency. But the key is, how do they think about things? So to them are patriotic. They may not have a choice to leave Russia, but they don't want to leave Russia. And the big question is, how are they going to live their lives?
Oliver.
I would say, because, while during this book I'd sort of traced Father Dimitri's life, which took me to quite unusual places, including to the far north and to the far west of Russia.
You certainly clocked up your train miles on the Russian railways.
I did, and a lot of, the impression you get is just a weariness and cynicism. It's not a support of Putin. So this Putin's majority is very much, I think there's a degree of cupboard love about it. While the pensions are paid and all that, people will say, OK, we'll go along with him. But this isn't active support. These are not people, sort of stormtroopers who are going to take to the streets and fight for him. If he keeps paying them, they'll be all right. If he doesn't, they'll go with someone else. And it is a picture of destitution so total. I mean, sort of 1 in 14 Russian villages have vanished since 91, and that is the overwhelming image, is not one of Putin prosperity.
Vlad, as we move towards the end, can you stare into the tea leaves on the bottom of the vodka glass and tell us what you think the legacy
English
of...
tea, yes.
The English tea, the good Russian black tea as well. Tell us what you think the legacy of Putin will be.
Well, you asked the wrong person. I'm a historian. I don't talk about legacy of something that is still continuing. I want to raise another image. I watched a wonderful film by Vladimir Mirzoev called Boris Godunov. And it's, of course, Pushkin's classic. And it's staged in today's Moscow. And, of course, the images that we get from Boris Godunov, people, the silent majority, take whatever outcome of political struggle happens, they support the winner. The boyars, they are divided and also support the strong man. There's one remarkable scene when Andrei Kurbsky, the traitor to the nation, who used to be an advisor of Ivan the Terrible, was returning to Russia on a tank. And when I watched this film, that was done shortly before December 2011, I thought, what kind of people will watch this film? If Putin watches this film, he get very wrong connotations from it.
Briefly, Rachel, do you stare into your tea leaves and see something rather more encouraging?
I have the same wariness as Vlad about predicting the future.
Well, I mean, again, because I'm very interested in the demographic angle, I think sadly Putin, he did have an opportunity to try and increase birth rate. He's failed, really. The post-Soviet generation is about to be the childbearing generation. So sadly, I think the future is one of less and less Russians. I mean, the UN prediction is that by between 2000 and 2050, Russia will lose 32 million people, and that's brutal.
There we must leave the motherland for today. Rachel Polonsky is from Murray Edwards College at the University of Cambridge and author of Molotov's Magic Lantern. Thanks to you. Also to Vladislav Zubok, Professor of International History at the LSE. His latest book is Zhivago's Children, The Last Russian Intelligentsia. Oliver Bullo's The Last Man in Russia and the Struggle to Save a Dying Nation is out now, as is Fiona Hill's Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. And both Fiona and Vladislav are taking part in a conference at the LSE today with a public lecture at 6:30 tonight. Next week, Jonathan Freeland searches for truth in a dystopian future with Harry Kunzru, James Robertson and Jane Rogers. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Done exactly the same. He's been a blank slate for the Russian people because there's so little known about his real background. He has been able to assume sometimes these rather fantastical guises. He's been, again, like Mr. Benn, a firefighter. He's been a deep-sea diver, though we actually now know he didn't dive quite so deep when he was retrieving an amphora from the bottom of the Black Sea. It was apparently only about 10 feet or something like that, a few metres. But nonetheless, he's really got into the spirit of this. And the question is why? Part of it is to create this very vigorous political image. It's been a way of showing everybody he's the action man for Russia. He's the person who can really do everything, the indispensable figure. But it's also a part of mobilisation of the population.
Because he targets various... I noticed that there's one website which has 39 different images of him, including a Russian leader. They often don't like to be seen as having weaknesses or family turmoil.
And Putin is actually, that's very interesting that he's done this, because Putin is somebody who's really put his private life off limits. One of the things that has been extraordinarily difficult before this announcement was actually to find any details out about Lyudmila and his two daughters. His daughters are conspicuously absent from this incredible array of public imagery. Lyudmila hadn't been seen with Putin for years, in fact. There were even rumours in Russia that she'd been sent to a nunnery, which is rather medieval, even in the Russian context. And I think in many respects he stepped forward because he's obviously now in the process of recrafting his public image again. Something that Putin has done has been engaged in this perpetual political campaign. And every time there's a sense of trouble, which is one of the junctures that we are now, he comes up.
Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
Hello. I remember being a new correspondent in Russia in the early 90s, taking a wrong turning and driving right up to the door of the Kremlin. Today, a lot of people in Russia and outside it are asking if the country itself has taken a wrong turn. Vladimir Putin's Kremlin has become a fortress of unrivalled power. He's turned ruthlessly on domestic foes and on foreign influences too. Well, round the table to unravel the enigma of Mr. Putin and of the diverse and troubled country he leads, I'm joined by the historian and academic Vladislav Zubok, by Oliver Bülow, who's embarked on an adventure to understand the traces of the Soviet past in the present, and by Rachel Polonsky, who's written about the culture of Russia. But let's start with Fiona Hill. She's co-author of a book on Putin's rise to power entitled Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. Fiona, you characterise Putin as a Mr. Ben type figure, various roles that he plays in public life when it suits him or when he needs the votes. Who is the real Putin?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think we'll ever really know who is the real Putin. Maybe not even after some time has elapsed, if he ever leaves the political stage, because there's so many uncertainties about elements of his biography. But just like Mr. Ben, which was my favourite cartoon when I was a kid here in the UK, not everybody outside of the UK quite grasped the Mr. Ben concept, but I think for anyone listening today, if they remember that from the 70s and 80s, remember Mr. Ben was something of a faceless cartoon figure, but he assumed these great identities with every day's new adventure in the magic costume shop. And Putin is
calming a tiger, as you do, hunting
right.
bears, doing any
exactly.
possible demographic,
and basically tagging whales, anything imaginable. And actually, the things that you've just picked up on there, he says are very important for him. That's conservation. It's taking pride in Russia's vast territory and its nature. He's trying to mobilise the Russian population behind various causes, not just in support of him. He actually says that he himself selects many of these roles that he plays. And of course, this just further obfuscates what is the real Mr. Putin.
But what did you then make of the announcement of the divorce from Ludmilla, his long-standing and possibly long-suffering wife? Because that was a case where he was putting himself out there as a man like any other with family troubles, albeit quite controlled. That's a different side of